I'm so pleased to introduce Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. He was born in Jamaica, Queens, New York, raised by parents deeply influenced by liberation theology and the Black Power movement. Dr. Kendi followed up on his 26th bestseller, Stamped from the Beginning, with a new book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is reshaping conversations about racial justice and pointing us toward new ways of thinking about ourselves and thinking about each other. Dr. Kendi is a National Book Award winner, a New York Times bestselling author, founding director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University, professor of history and international relations, and winner of the 2019 Guggenheim Fellowship. I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Kendi.
Hey, how are you?
Hi. Thank you so much for joining us virtually and sitting down to chat with me. How are you?
I'm okay. How are you doing? I'm happy we're able to sit down and chat.
Great, thanks. I'm just going to dig in and start where most conversations are starting these days, and that's about the current moment we're living under right now, under COVID-19. And I was really struck by a compelling argument, an article you wrote just this month in The Atlantic entitled, "We're Still Living and Dying in the Slaveholders' Republic." In the article, you talk about the protests that have been taking place across the nation to open up the economy and to liberate states from these stay-at-home orders. And I love how you talk about the idea of freedom. You say, again and again, white Americans have sacrificed the freedom from in pursuit of the freedom to. Again and again, the price of those decisions have fallen on the heads of people of color. So I'd love for you to speak about these historical ideas of freedom and bring them into this current moment and really help us connect the dots between what we're seeing today and kind of historical events.
Yeah, and I think that was just sort of the point, because I think that it's critical for Americans to realize when an individual or group of individuals are stating right now that their freedoms are being constrained by stay-at-home orders, and that they want the freedom to essentially go and do as they please. They're essentially saying they want the freedom to infect, and they want the ability to do whatever they want at any time that they want it to the larger community. So in other words, their individual, what's best for them as an individual trumps what's best for the community. And this sounds a lot like the slaveholders, right? Who they wanted a society in America where they had the freedom to enslave, the freedom to exploit, freedom to rape, the freedom to kill. And we contrast that notion of the freedom to with the freedom from enslaved people, just like people who are social distancing and are trying every which way to not be infected. Freedom from slavery, freedom from exploitation, freedom from, in coronavirus terms, infection. And so we've had this dueling conflict over freedom really since the founding of this republic.
Thank you for that. I want to talk a little bit too about your journey, and your book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, has been described as a confessional of self-examination. You have said that being an anti-racist requires persistent self-awareness, constant self-criticism, and regular self-examination. Can you talk a bit more about your own personal journey, kind of working through preconceived notions of racism and how that's informed your evolution towards a more structured approach to addressing racist policies?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly was a long, winding, difficult sort of journey. And I think first and foremost, what allowed me to recognize that I needed to be different or a different type of person was coming to terms with some basic definitions and coming to terms and really being honest sort of with myself. So those basic definitions is things like a racist idea. So defining a racist idea in a very clear and consistent way. I ended up defining a racist idea as any idea that suggests a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way. And meaning superior and inferior, that means if you believe something is wrong with a racial group, you're saying something is inferior. Or if you believe something is better about a racial group, you're saying something is superior. And so I had to interrogate myself. Do I have any racist ideas about Black women? Do I consider Black women in any way inferior to white women? Do I have any racist ideas about Black poor people? Do I think that Black poor people are lazier than white poor people? Do I have any racist ideas about Black lesbians? Do I think they're more hypersexual than white lesbians? And ultimately, I began to realize that I did. That I had all of these. I was born and raised in a home that in which Blackness and Black people were celebrated. All the while, I didn't realize I was consuming and believing anti-Black racist ideas, let alone racist ideas about other racial groups. And those racist ideas were preventing me from seeing the true source of Black pain, which was racist policies, the true source of that source, which was racist power. And so I spent parts of my life going after Black people as opposed to racist power and policy. And every moment I was not going against racist power and policy, and I was believing Black people were the problem, was a moment in which I certainly was not being anti-racist. And so I had to come to grips with that. And I had to challenge myself. And obviously very difficult, to do, but it's necessary. And I'm still doing it. I'm still trying to shed my ideas about Black women and about Black poor people and about other racial groups that have been instilled in me.
Yeah, and I know you talked about this a lot, right? Because I know what challenges are kind of some of the terminology in our thinking in terms of we've been taught that, for example, people of color or Black people can't be racist because we don't hold power, and we don't have power. And I love the way you really kind of set the record straight on the idea of racist power and talking about power. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Sure. Yeah, I think we have to be very clear on what power is. And so at an individual level, so if we're talking about whether an individual Black person can be racist, then we have to understand how power operates at an individual level. If we're talking about whether Black people collectively can be racist, that's a completely different conversation. But with the first conversation, individual power exists at the policy making level. In other words, you have individuals who are sitting in policy making positions. So they have the ability to either make or break racist or anti-racist policies. You have power exists at a policy managing level. These are the people who execute as middle managers policies, racist or anti-racist, and they have the ability to not execute them, to defy their bosses, to defy those policies. And then every single individual has the power to resist, has the power to resist those policies, has the power to resist those policymakers. And some of us don't resist those policies, don't resist them because we think something else is the problem, naming Native people or Latino people or Black people. And so we spend our time going after people because we have racist ideas, as opposed to using our power to resist. And so if there's ever been a self-defeating idea that was presented as radical, it was this idea that people of color or even Black people have no power. And people and people of color more broadly have used their power to resist over the course of the modern era, from the United States and all over the sort of modern world. And you've had people of color who've gotten into positions of power and have used that policy-making power to relieve Black people of their pain, to institute anti-racist policies, just like you've had Ben Carson's of the world, you've had Clarence Thomas's of the world, who've gotten into these powerful positions and introduced white supremacy.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. A lot of us are working towards building multiracial coalitions, and we're coming from different backgrounds, different ethnicities and races. How do you think that we can work through these differences and hold ourselves accountable for our own kind of what we would call internalized racism?
Well, I think this idea that people of color be racist, I think it handicaps, it prevents organizing among people of color, because what it prevents is it prevents someone like me realizing all of the anti-Native ideas that I have consumed that then prevents me from forming an authentic, mutually beneficial relationship with a Native people or a Native organization or for a Native cause. And it's the same thing about Latinx, anti-Latinx racist ideas, anti-Asian racist ideas. And so I think first and foremost, it is critical for people of color and white allies to realize their own racist ideas about these other groups, because there's no way we're going to be able to form healthy coalitions. Like, how are Black people going to form healthy coalitions with Latinx? We think that Latinx immigrants are rapists and murderers. How can Latinx people build an authentic coalition with Black people if they believe Black people are dangerous criminals and their communities are such? It's impossible. And I think over the course of history, I don't think we've recognized just how much our consumption of racist ideas of other peoples of color that have oftentimes been taught to us by white people have prevented this interracial organizing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very, very much agreed. Thank you for that. I know that I'm like throwing you a bunch of questions because I know our time is so limited. There's just a million things I'd love to talk with you about. But I was, one thing I was really struck from something you said, I hope that through my work or in my lifetime that we can eradicate the term racist from the vocabulary so that we can have an accounting of ourselves, of our ideas, of our policies. It's such a worthwhile goal to think about that. And I want to say that so many of us in this work are also trying to challenge these norms. And you talk about that being anti-racist, to challenge these norms and put out ideas and, bodies of work that oftentimes, can't get immediate traction because they have to be validated. They have to be made credible by someone else, right? So when you think about someone like you have really been tackling like even a vernacular and trying to really give us kind of clear definitions of these terms that we've come so used to, how do you think about this idea of us trying to push out, challenging the norm, and tackling these really big issues? What advice would you give us there for someone who is now seeing his work really part of a national discourse about race and really helping and reshaping our thinking about how we talk about racism and how we use terms?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to eradicate the term not racist from the American vocabulary. I'd love to eradicate the term race neutral from the American vocabulary. I'd love to eradicate the term colorblind from the American vocabulary, but starting with not racist. Can you imagine if all Americans realized that in given moment, we're either being racist or anti-racist. So Americans are not able to say, I'm not racist, right after they said something that was racist. So they would then have to prove that they're being anti-racist. And you know, and then can you imagine if every American recognized that a racist idea is any idea that suggests the racial group is better or worse than another, or anti-racist idea is any idea that suggests the racial groups are equals, and they assessed every one of their racial ideas based on those two definitions. And or what if Americans, Elaine, eliminated the term race neutral policy? And Americans defined any policy that led to racial inequity or injustice as racist, and any policy that led to equity and justice as anti-racist. It didn't matter whether the policy had racial language in them. It did not matter whether the person intended to create inequity and injustice. It didn't matter where it was, whether it was in the North, in the South, whether it was somebody who identifies as radical or progressive or liberal or conservative. If a policy is leading to inequity, it's racist. Can you imagine the type of society we could build, particularly in this political moment, where no American or few Americans want to be considered racist? So that would, in a sense, compel people to strive to be anti-racist, to stop, to get out of this sort of pit of denial that they call being not racist, and really begin to confess their racist ideas, really acknowledge the diagnosis that they are racist, so that they can ultimately get treatment, so that they can ultimately be anti-racist. I think we'd have a different type of country.
Mm-hmm. I think about, you know, what you're saying, and I wonder, how do you think about your framework and what you're introducing? Do you think it can be a vehicle for truth and reconciliation? And if so, what would that look like for you?
Oh, I think it could. I think that first and foremost, you can't find truth if you do not have a consistent and a clear idea of what the problem is, right? And of what a problem idea is, what a problem policy is, what a problem person is. You can't even begin to get to the truth of racism if people do not consistently and clearly understand what racism is. So that's one of the things that, you know, there's so many incredible scholars today who are studying racism and all of its manifestations and even intersections with other forms of bigotry. And one of the things that I'm trying to do with my work is not only, of course, create original research, but also clarify the work, the findings of all these scholars, so that people can understand and see racism for themselves, so they can see the truth. And then that truth then builds towards reconciliation. But we can't reconcile if we're not willing to confess. And really the heartbeat, I say it over and over again to the heavens, the heartbeat of anti-racism is confession. You cannot even begin to be anti-racist if you're not willing to confess the racist ideas that you consume. And, you know, this doesn't mean you're a bad person. This just means you're an American. Because to be an American, to grow up in this country, really to grow up in many different countries around the world, is to be raised to be racist. And so that confession is essential to reconciliation. And the desire, and the clear-eyed desire to build equity and justice, is essential to reconciliation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. It's so well said. I want to bring us back a little bit to a COVID conversation. And, you know, with the rapid pace in which policy is moving, we're seeing some bigger things like talks around a universal basic income, early release of a prison population, housing homeless communities. Also, at the same time, acceleration of other types of racist policies, closing borders, limiting immigration, blaming immigrant communities. How can we use this moment to think about racist ideas and racist policies and undo them as we are in the process of rebuilding and thinking about recovery?
So I think we can do two things at once. And so we can be clear-eyed about the inequities from, you know, people of color disproportionately dying and being infected with COVID-19 to the people who are losing their jobs being disproportionately people of color, or the people who are the essential workers who are forced to leave their home each day are disproportionately people of color. We can so we can recognize those disparities. We can then try to figure out, okay, what are the ways, what are the policies that we can put in place that ends homelessness in America, that ends poverty in America, that not only reduces the number of people overall who are dying of COVID, but certainly closes the racial disparities simultaneously. But then we can also simultaneously defend against those who were initially saying that Black people are disproportionately dying of COVID-19 because they're not taking the virus seriously, because they're not socially distancing. And then suddenly those very same people had nothing to say when they saw white people primarily protesting all over this country to open it back up without wearing any masks, clearly not social distancing, clearly demonstrating, as surveys have consistently shown, that indeed white people were less likely to take this virus seriously than any racial group. So then it suddenly switched to, oh, it's Black people are dying because of pre-existing conditions. That's the reason why. And then it's typically explained why Black people are more likely to have asthma or heart disease or respiratory disease. Or they do explain it and they say, well, it's because Black people eat poorly, or Black people refuse to take care of their health, or Black people are obese because of their own laziness, so this fat shaming. And so we can challenge those ideas. We can say things like, well, actually, studies show that what's more predictive of COVID infection and death rates than pre-existing conditions is a polluted neighborhood through water or air. What's more predictive of pre-existing conditions is access to health insurance and medical care. What's more predictive is indeed your employment status. What's more, there are other factors that are actually more predictive, and we can demonstrate that and show that at the same time we're addressing those factors through our own advocacy.
Well, let's talk about the issue of surveillance, right? Because we know that there have been some punitive and somewhat aggressive police actions and targeting certain communities. We know who has been targeted for not wearing a mask in New York. We saw data around that, and we continue to see all sorts of data that certainly tells us who's actually, how they're being cared for, who's being cared for, and what's happening in our community, and also who's being surveilled. Can you speak in the ways that your framework of kind of racist power, racist ideas informs the ramifications of surveillance and looking at data, quite frankly?
So when we do studies, for instance, of the ideas that police officers have about race in America, white police officers far and away believe that the reasons why people of color are on the lower end of disparities, whether economic and others, is because of their own behavior. Police officers, as well as Americans in general, believe that Black people and certainly Latinx people are more dangerous and violent, and their neighborhoods are more dangerous and violent. And so when you have this general racist idea combined with a more specific idea among the police forces who come from the general American sort of populace, and then you institute a policy that in which you use policing forces to surveil or even to punish those who are not social distancing, it's not difficult to figure out what's going to happen. And certainly what happened in New York City. I'm tired of mayors, city councilmen and women using police to solve social problems. At some point, we have to realize it is a bad idea for a police officer, even if they're well-meaning, to be in the business of solving social issues, certainly public health issues. I mean, and so, it was just, I'm sure, like everyone else, it was shocking while at the same time not shocking. Seeing the images of white people who are not social distancing and wearing a mask, being given masks by a police officer who had a mask in parks in New York City. And a few miles away, you have Black people who are not social distancing being picked up by police officers who are not wearing masks, let alone giving them masks. I mean, even though we know, unfortunately, NYPD is riddled with cops who are infected. And so it's just, I think that was striking for people, but it's what happens when we view police officers as problem solvers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Certainly, we're certainly not going to arrest our way out of this pandemic, and also see that we're using police force to solve a health crisis and an economic crisis. I know that we have a few minutes left before Q&A, and there's a couple more questions I want to squeeze in. So I want to talk a little bit about this idea of intersection. And you spoke a lot in terms of your personal journey and how you think about that. Can you give us a little bit more of a glimpse on what you think the foundational pillars are of bringing change from kind of that intersectional lens, and how you would describe that in terms of your own framework?
Yeah, so, for my sort of framework and really the way I've sought to understand racism, at its foundation has been intersectional, theory from theorists like, Kimberly Crenshaw and others. And what's been foundational is one of the things that I emphasize, even, let's say, going back to how I define a racist idea, any idea that suggests a racial group is superior or inferior. The reason why I used racial group as a race is because you take, for instance, Black people. Black people are a collection of racial groups based on all these intersecting identities. And so, in other words, you have Black women sitting at the intersection of race and certainly gender, and Black men the same. And so you have these distinct race gender groups, just as the same thing about when it comes to Black elites and Black poor people, or obviously white elites and what white elites call white trash. And same thing as it relates to, sexuality or sexual orientation and race. And what happens is people just don't denigrate Black people in general. There aren't just racist ideas targeting Black people in general. There are specific ideas targeting Black women that are not targeting white women. Mm-hmm. There are specific ideas targeting Black poor people that are not targeting Black elites and that are not targeting white poor people. There are specific racist ideas that are denigrating white transgender women that are not specifically denigrating Black transgender women, that is not specifically denigrating white transgender women. And so I think it's critical for us to recognize that all these intersecting identities have led to racist ideas about all these intersecting identities, in which the racist idea is intersecting with the other form of bigotry. And so you can't really understand racist ideas if you don't understand sexist ideas. If you can't really understand racist ideas about Black queer people without understanding homophobic ideas. You can't understand, and so one of the things that I've emphasized to people is it's easy for me as a Black man, a Black heterosexual man, to say, oh yeah, Black heterosexuals are equal to white heterosexuals, or Black men are equal to white men. But I'm not being anti-racist if I also believe that white women are more beautiful than Black women. I'm not being anti-racist if I believe that Black poor people are undeserving and white poor people are deserving. And so one of the things that I want us to recognize is, if we have a racist idea about any of these racial groups, we're being racist.